The desert that summer burned hotter than any man could remember. The wind carried dust like smoke, stinging eyes and cracking lips. The sky was a white furnace, and the earth below it was a bed of dying thorns. For miles, nothing moved except the wind and the distant shimmer of heat. It was the kind of day that stripped hope right out of a man. Somewhere on that empty plain, a horse stumbled, and the man riding it steadied the reins with hands rough as rope. His name was Samuel Carter, and the desert had become his home, his burden, and his battlefield. Sam Carter was a poor rancher, the kind most folks in town barely noticed. His ranch sat between two dry hills and a creek that hadn't run since spring. He'd come west chasing the same promise every man had: land, freedom, and a chance to leave something behind. But the desert had its own rules. It took more than it gave, and it gave nothing easy. Sam had built his house with his own hands, dug his own well, and buried his wife behind the cottonwoods when the fever came. Now only his son Luke shared what was left of his life, and even that was slipping through his calloused fingers. Luke was 15, thin as a fence post but tough, with the same stubborn streak as his father. He was the kind of boy who would ride half a day to fetch a stray calf and never complain. But lately, Luke had been weak, coughing deep and low like something was eating him from the inside. The fever had come slow, then fierce, leaving his skin cold one moment and burning the next. Sam had tried everything: cold rags, boiled herbs, even a doctor from town who charged him the price of a horse just to say there was nothing he could do but wait. The land around them was dying too. Cattle fell where they stood, tongues hanging, eyes dull. The well behind the barn gave nothing but mud. Every day, Sam watched the horizon for clouds that never came. He'd walk out at dawn, touch the dry ground, and feel the weight of his failures pressing into the earth. He wasn't afraid of death. He'd seen plenty of it, but he feared losing the boy more than losing the land. The thought of burying Luke beside his mother was enough to twist his heart into knots. One afternoon, when the air shimmered like glass, Sam saddled his horse to check the far water hole. It was 2 miles out, just a shallow depression in the rock that sometimes caught runoff when it rained, but rain hadn't come for months. Still, it was all he had left to hope for. He rode slow, hat pulled low, dust curling around the horse's legs. The silence was so thick it rang in his ears. Then, in the distance, something moved. 3 specks against the glare, riding low and steady across the flats. He squinted, hand shading his eyes, and felt the chill crawl up his neck. They weren't settlers. He could tell by the way they rode. Light, silent, bodies bent with the horses. They came closer, and his gut tightened. Apache. 2 grown men and a boy, their ponies staggering with thirst. The Apaches were the desert's shadow, unseen until it was too late. The ranchers feared them more than the rattlesnakes or drought. For months, talk in town had been of raids, killings, burned wagons. The army rode patrols, but the desert swallowed both sides the same way. Sam knew what could happen if they saw him, and worse, if he showed fear. He pulled his Winchester from the saddle scabbard and waited. The lead Apache raised his hand, palm open. A peace gesture. Sam didn't lower the rifle. He'd heard stories of men who believed that sign and ended up with arrows through their hearts. But the way the ponies stumbled told another story. Exhaustion, hunger, thirst. The young one could hardly stay upright. When the leader spoke, it wasn't English, but rough. Broken Spanish, agua, water. His voice was dry as gravel, but the word hit like a plea more than a demand. Sam looked down at the water hole, a muddy pit, barely enough for one man's horse. He hesitated. His own animals needed that water. His boy was dying at home, and this was all he had left to keep him alive. But as he stared at the faces before him, he saw no hatred, no war, just men pushed past the edge of survival. He thought of his wife, the way she used to say mercy was the last thing a man should ever lose. Slowly, he took a step back, motioned to the hole, and said quietly, "Let your horses drink." The Apaches moved forward carefully, eyes never leaving him. They led their ponies to the water and let them drink first, then knelt down, scooping muddy water into their hands. The boy swayed, too weak to hold steady, and when he fell forward, Sam acted without thinking. He caught him, eased him to the ground, and pulled his own canteen from his belt. The older warriors stiffened, hands to their knives, until they saw what Sam was doing, pouring his last few swallows of clean water between the boy's cracked lips. The boy drank greedily, gasping, eyes fluttering. The warriors relaxed, watching in silence. When the boy could stand again, the leader nodded once to Sam, slow, deliberate, a gesture of respect between men who had no reason to trust each other. Then they mounted their horses and rode off into the dying light. Sam stood there long after they disappeared, the wind whispering through the sage. He felt something heavy in his chest, not fear, not pride, but the strange stillness that comes when a man does what he knows is right, no matter what it costs. By the time he reached home, the sun had sunk into a crimson haze. The house looked smaller in the dusk, leaning against the horizon like it was tired too. Inside, Luke lay sweating, breathing shallow. Sam wiped his forehead with a wet cloth and tried to smile. "You hang in there, boy," he whispered. "You got more fight in you than this fever." The boy mumbled something in his sleep, words Sam couldn't catch. Outside, a coyote cried, and the night grew heavy around them. The next day was worse. The heat rose early, and the air tasted like ash. Sam's horse stumbled near the corral, too weak to stand. He was running out of everything: water, food, hope. By evening, Luke's breathing had turned ragged. Sam sat by his side, eyes burning, praying for a miracle he didn't believe would come. That was when the knock came at the door. It was soft but steady, not the sound of fear, but purpose. Sam grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. In the silver light of the moon stood two shadows. The leader was the same Apache from the water hole. Beside him, another man held a small leather pouch. Sam's stomach tightened. He raised the rifle slightly, unsure if this was mercy returned or death delayed. The Apache spoke softly in Spanish. "Boy, sick?" Sam hesitated, then nodded. The warrior pointed at the pouch. "Medicine." The word was strange on his tongue, but clear enough. He placed the pouch on the ground and stepped back. For a moment, neither man moved. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust between them. Then, as quietly as they'd come, the Apaches turned and melted into the darkness. Sam stood staring after them until the night swallowed their shapes. He lowered his rifle, heart pounding, and bent to pick up the pouch. Inside, wrapped in deer hide, were herbs, roots, and dried leaves that smelled of smoke and mint. He didn't know what any of it was, but he knew desperation when he felt it. He boiled the herbs in the kettle, made a bitter tea, and spooned it slowly into Luke's mouth. The boy stirred, coughed once, and swallowed. Sam sat there all night, waiting, watching the fire burn down to embers. Just before dawn, Luke's breathing eased. His face lost that deathly pale look. He fell into a deep, calm sleep. And when the first light crept through the cracks of the wall, his skin was cool. Sam let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Days passed, and Luke grew stronger. The fever broke completely, leaving him weak but alive. Sam never saw the Apaches again, but their act stayed with him. Every time he looked at the pouch of herbs, he felt something shift inside him. A quiet understanding that mercy can cross even the fiercest divides. The land was still cruel, the drought unbroken, but somehow it all felt different now. The desert hadn't changed. Sam had. Then, one morning, riders came from Fort Bowie. The soldiers brought news that Apache raiders had struck a wagon train to the south. Settlers were dead, and the army meant to ride at dawn for revenge. The officer in charge, a young lieutenant with bright brass buttons, asked if Sam had seen anything. Any tracks, any movement? Sam hesitated. He thought of the boy, of the medicine, of the quiet nod in the moonlight. "No," he said finally. "Nothing but wind." The lieutenant frowned, but he didn't push it. He tipped his hat and rode on. That night, Sam stood outside, staring at the stars scattered like dust across the black sky. Somewhere out there, men were killing and dying over land and water. The same water he had shared, the same mercy that had saved his son. He thought of the boy's tired face, the way the warrior had said, "medicine," like a prayer. For the first time, Sam wondered if enemies were made by choice or by need. If the desert, in all its emptiness, had more room for compassion than men did. The days grew hotter, the drought deeper. But Sam didn't feel the same fear anymore. When he rode out to check the waterhole again, he saw new tracks, hoof prints, light and small, leading east. He followed them for a mile before they vanished into stone. He never found the Apaches again, but he began leaving small things by the hole. Dried meat, tobacco, sometimes a half pouch of coffee. He never saw who took them, but by morning, they were always gone. And once, in their place, he found a single eagle feather stuck in the sand. Luke asked him once, months later, if he believed the Apaches were still nearby. Sam just smiled faintly and said, "Son, they're part of this land same as we are. And maybe, just maybe, they know we ain't all bad." Luke didn't answer. He just looked out at the horizon, where the desert met the sky, and said quietly, "Maybe they ain't either." Sam nodded. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but something in him had changed. He'd seen mercy in the eyes of men he'd been taught to hate, and that was a thing no bullet could ever erase. Weeks passed, and the desert began to whisper of war. Riders brought word that more settlers were missing. Ranches burned, soldiers ambushed in the canyons. Fear spread like brush fire, hotter than the sun. Every man carried a rifle now, even when fetching water. The talk in town was vengeance, swift, final, and merciless. But Sam Carter kept his silence. He'd seen the faces of those people the others called savages. He'd seen their exhaustion, their desperation, their humanity. He knew revenge would feed nothing but the dust. Still, he also knew silence could get a man killed just as quick. Then one morning, as the horizon shimmered gold, Sam saw smoke rising from the southern ridge. He saddled his horse and rode out, the air sharp with tension. When he reached the ridge, he saw what was left of a supply wagon, burned, splintered, its wheel half buried in sand. 2 Army scouts lay dead beside it. The tracks told a clear story. Apache ponies, at least a dozen, but among them, Sam saw something else. A small print, light, familiar. The boy, the same one who had drunk from his canteen that day by the waterhole. He knelt beside the prints, his heart twisting. He didn't know what had happened or why, but he couldn't believe the same people who'd saved his son had done this. Maybe they were different Apaches. Maybe not. The desert didn't give answers. He turned his horse toward home, but before he could ride, he heard hoofbeats behind him. Soldiers. The same lieutenant from before, leading a dozen men, rifles gleaming. "Carter!" the officer shouted. "You seen tracks?" Sam looked down at the ground, at the prints that told 2 stories at once. He swallowed hard and said, "No, sir, nothing here worth chasing." The lieutenant stared, suspicious, but time was short and tempers shorter. He ordered his men forward, and they rode south, spurs flashing in the sun. Sam stayed where he was, staring after them. The dust from their horses rose like ghosts in the wind. He knew they'd ride straight into the Apache camp, men, women, children, and turn it to ash. He closed his eyes, hearing his wife's voice again. Don't let hate eat what's left of your soul. When he opened them, he made his choice. He turned his horse west, toward the canyons, toward the people he once called enemies. By nightfall, he found them. A narrow pass, hidden between red cliffs, opened into a small valley where fires flickered under the rocks. He saw the boy, alive, sitting by the flames. The same leader stood nearby, tall, proud, watching the stars. Sam rode forward slowly, hands empty. The camp stirred, warriors drawing bows, knives flashing. But the leader raised his hand. The same open palm gesture he'd given that first day. Sam dismounted, heart pounding, and spoke the only word that mattered. Soldiers. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Sam pointed east. Coming! Many men. Tonight. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The warrior looked at him, long, searching, then nodded once. He turned, barking orders in a language Sam didn't understand. Within minutes, the camp was moving. Fires stamped out, ponies saddled, children lifted onto backs. Sam stood watching, the moonlight washing the canyon silver. The boy he'd saved, or maybe who had saved him, walked up and pressed something into his hand. It was the same eagle feather he'd left by the water hole. Sam's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck. The boy just smiled faintly and disappeared into the dark. When the soldiers arrived at dawn, they found nothing but ashes. They cursed, kicked the dirt, and accused Sam of warning them. He didn't deny it. The lieutenant called him a traitor, said he'd answer for it in court. But before they could arrest him, gunfire cracked from the ridge. The Apaches had circled back, not to kill, but to protect the women and children escaping through the far pass. The soldiers scattered, and chaos exploded across the valley. Sam dove behind a boulder, bullets whining overhead, the air thick with dust and screams. He didn't know who fired first or who fell last. He only knew that somewhere in that storm of smoke and fear, the boy's voice called out, and the soldier's rifle lowered. The two locked eyes across the distance, both young, both afraid. For a heartbeat, the shooting stopped. That silence, brief as it was, spread like a shock wave through the canyon. Men on both sides hesitated. The Apaches melted away, disappearing into the cliffs. The soldiers, too stunned to chase, gathered their dead and wounded. The war had not ended, but something inside it had cracked. When it was over, the lieutenant turned to Sam. His face was pale, his voice quiet. You did this? Sam nodded. Maybe I did, but maybe it needed doing. The lieutenant didn't answer. He just looked toward the empty canyon, where the dust still hung like a ghost between the cliffs. Sam mounted his horse, turned toward home, and rode into the rising sun. He didn't know if the Apaches had escaped for good, or if another fight waited beyond the horizon. But he knew mercy had found a way to breathe in a place made for killing. And that was enough. Back at the ranch, Luke was waiting on the porch, stronger now, his face full of light. Pa, he said, did they get away? Sam smiled faintly, eyes drifting to the far ridge. Yeah, son, they got away. The boy nodded, like he already knew. Together they stood, watching the desert burn gold under the morning sun. The world hadn't changed much. Still hard, still cruel. But in the heart of one poor rancher, something had shifted forever. Sometimes, Sam thought, it only takes a sip of water to end a war.